I always knew that my grandfather lived an extraordinary life. I would tell people that my aunt was born in what is current-day Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, while he was helping to set up the Bank of England in sub-Saharan Africa. I had an incredible opening into the world of cricket, because he was a long-time member of the prestigious Marylebone Cricket Club. However, to me, he was the happy-go-lucky man who got up at 6 in the morning to go water the plants and raise the flag of whatever country he felt like on that day. He constantly used made-up words to lighten the mood and played football with me in the back garden until well into his 90s. I took it for granted when I was young, but it was a huge part of my development to have someone that unfalteringly cheerful the whole time. It was only when I got old enough to understand the brutalities that he had been through that I could comprehend what he actually meant to me. Geoffrey Gough was born on the 12th of April, 1921. He and his father signed up to join the British Army the day that Britain declared war on Germany, the 3rd of September, 1939.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Geoffrey was 18, younger than most of us here. In 1940, he was accepted into the Indian Army, and after spending a cold winter on a ship outside Glasgow, he was shipped to India via the southern coast of Africa. He trained in India and remained there, practically inactive, until February of 1942. Geoffrey was then shipped to Singapore to be stationed there, while they were already in the process of surrendering to the Japanese. Less than 6 days later, the British Army officially surrendered to the Japanese, and Geoffrey was sent to Changi Jail, the site of the modern-day airport. The Japanese were not so kind to their prisoners. In fact, they hated the Chinese so much that on Changi Beach, they forced them to walk themselves into the water and drown. Geoffrey spent about 6 months in Changi prison. There were many men in one cell, and the living conditions were horrible. He was then put on a cattle train and sent up through Malaysia to what is modern-day Thailand, then called Siam, to start work on the new Burma Railway, which would allow the Japanese soldiers to travel to India more quickly, which is where they next planned their attack. Encaptured labour goes against the Geneva Convention, but it was far worse than that. Soldiers were treated horribly. Very little access to food, water, and the working conditions were horrible. Japanese soldiers would often beat the prisoners if they thought they weren't working well enough. When they realized that the railway wasn't going to be complete in the right time frame, they increased the beatings, and this resulted in many, many deaths. Geoffrey was lucky to live, and yet somehow managed to keep his good spirit throughout the whole thing. A religious man, yet he was still willing to rip pages out of his Bible so that other soldiers could roll cigarettes. A true sign of who he was. He was kept there until the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, 3 years later. He was then shipped to Colombo in Sri Lanka, where he was able to put on enough weight to travel back home. Geoffrey became an advocate for peace. The horrors that he'd been through meant that he firmly believed that negotiation was always the right step. However, the debate has no real resolutions. As he pointed out to my mother, neither he, nor my mother, nor I would be alive today if the Americans had not dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War is the worst time. Yet somehow, he managed to keep going. I knew Geoffrey as one of the greatest men to have ever lived, all the way until his passing just a few years ago. He went on to live a very calm and modest life, yet still one filled with many, many adventures. He mustered up the courage to be able to speak to my school about the atrocities of the war, and that's when I really realized what he meant to me. Every time I face bad situations, I always think of him and his ability to remain a great person throughout the whole thing. He is truly an inspiration.